Order, please. We'll now move on with oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Premier said that there is no crisis in health care. Well, we thought he just misspoke, Mr. Speaker, but with today's budget, it appears that he really believes that. The health budget is flatlined, going up less than 1%. I'd like to ask the Premier why he continues to squeeze the health budget when the health care needs of Nova Scotians are so great.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I want to thank all Nova Scotians who continue to work hard with our government to bring us back to a position where we continue to make investments. As the honourable member would know, we've invested $3.5 million to hire 22 nurse practitioners, family practice nurses. In this budget, you'll see there's been an announcement of 10 residencies for doctors who are trained in Canada, another 10 that will be put in place for foreign-trained doctors to be able to make sure that we can provide those health care teams across our province to continue to provide primary health care to the citizens of this province. There was investment in orthopedic wait times, continue to make sure that those who require that surgery are getting in a timely fashion, and I'm encouraged as we work with this province holistically as one health authority that we began to use capacity inside of the healthcare system across the province with those 800 surgeries that will move into Windsor area, and the fact that Nova Scotians, regardless of where they live, are finding access for that surgical services in communities as quickly as possible.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday, Doctors Nova Scotia reported that we need 100 new doctors each and every year just to keep the status quo, Mr. Speaker, but in his budget today, the Premier offers only 20. Mr. Speaker, that is not a plan to make sure Nova Scotians get the health care they need. That is nothing but damage control, Mr. Speaker. When people want a vision for better health care, they get 1/5 of the need just to make things the same next year as they are today, and we know there's already 100,000 Nova Scotians without a doctor, and that problem apparently is only going to get worse under this government, Mr. Speaker. So I will ask the Premier, why is he allowing the doctor crisis to get worse?
Honourable Premier.
Actually, Mr. Speaker, what Doctors Nova Scotia said yesterday that we require about 50 primary care doctors and about 50 specialists in the process across the province, Mr. Speaker. Actually, Mr. Speaker, what they actually said was there would be 50 primary care, 50 surgical required specialist surgeries, Mr. Speaker. If you look since July of last year, we had 170, Mr. Speaker, 70 primary health care doctors, about 100 specialists who've come into the province. But I want to assure the honourable member that the 20 seats that were announced in this budget are on top of, Mr. Speaker, the seats that are already made available, which means the Nova Scotians will have access to more than 50 primary health care physicians every year in our province.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, there is 118 doctor vacancies on the Health Authority website right now, and the Premier is offering 20. We're going to be falling further and further behind, Mr. Speaker, because this government has no vision for better health care. And that's ironic because that's the same Premier who promised a doctor for every Nova Scotian. Well, we already knew that promise was thrown in the trash can a long time ago. Now it's officially broken, not just for one more year, but forever under the life of this government, Mr. Speaker, because they've given up on trying to make sure Nova Scotians get the doctors that they need. So I would like to ask the Premier, why is he abandoning now the 100,000 Nova Scotians who need a doctor today?
The Honourable Premier.
Again, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable for the question. Again, I want to remind him what Doctors Nova Scotia said yesterday, Mr. Speaker, that we require 50 primary care doctors in the province. There will be another 50 for specialty services. Very proud of the fact that we've been able to hire 170 positions, Mr. Speaker. About 71 of those are primary health care. The remainder are specialty care. But the fact of the matter is we know, and there are communities across this province that require more health care providing teams. It's why, on top of the residency seats that already exist in our province, we're adding another 20, which will take us over the 50 complement the Doctors Nova Scotia were talking about yesterday. We're excited about that fact. We're really, Mr. Speaker, encouraged by the fact that when you look at the international students, that's an avenue path back home to our province for our sons and daughters to be medically trained elsewhere. That's a positive sign, Mr. Speaker. We're looking forward to continuing to work with them to build those collaborative teams. What they also said, Mr. Speaker, we've heard loud and clear from doctors across the province who are currently practicing. They want to be part of a team. They want a nurse practitioner, family practice nurse. Some cases, they want a social worker to be part of that team so they can look at determine themselves. And, Mr. Speaker, we're continuing to deal with the issues that face Nova Scotia, and we're continuing to work with them in a positive way.
The Honourable Leader in the House of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier also. Mr. Speaker, it is no secret this government is balancing its books in part by starving our hospitals. In today's budget, we learned that the Liberal government underspent the hospital infrastructure budget by more than 50%. Again last year, Mr. Speaker. In the last 3 years, this government has underspent the hospital infrastructure by $82 million. I repeat, $82 million, Mr. Speaker. So I ask the Premier, why has this government ignored the hospital infrastructure needs of this province for 3.5 years and put the health and the safety of our patients and workers at risk?
The Honourable Premier.
I want to thank the gentleman for the question, Mr. Speaker. Very proud of the investments we're making in healthcare infrastructure across the province, the investments we're making in New Waterford, the investments we're making in Pugwash, the investments we made in Shelburne, Mr. Speaker. All of those are being made, Mr. Speaker, with plans, foundation around them. One of the challenges that we were faced when we came into government, the former government made a number of promises to communities with no plans, no vision about how they're going to even build the infrastructure. We had to go out to work with those communities to put in place, and we're continuing to work with those communities. And Mr. Speaker, I was so pleased to be in Shelburne. I was so pleased to be in Shelburne on the weekend. I was so pleased to be in Shelburne on the weekend, Mr. Speaker, when I heard the municipal leaders in that community toting the praises of this government, because they said finally a government has listened to Mr. Speaker and put their money where their mouth was and invested in the community.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This Premier simply just not get it. Mr. Speaker, the Auditor General has identified $85 million funding gap in the hospital infrastructure needs in this province. The needs is there, Mr. Speaker, yet Mr. Speaker, for 3.5 years, the Premier has told Nova Scotians there is no money. The cupboard is bare. But in fact, the money has been there all along. But instead of addressing the needs, the Liberal government has been putting the health and safety of patients and workers at risk so it can stand here today and beat its chest on the eve of election. So I ask the Premier to explain to the patients and workers why this government has underspent the hospital infrastructure budget by $82 million in the last 3 years.
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, again, I want to thank the gentleman for the question. I want to remind him every budget that we've introduced in this House, Mr. Speaker, we've continued to invest in healthcare infrastructure. I'm very proud of what's taking place. Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud of the work that's taking place. Mr. Speaker, in Dartmouth, we're continuing 3rd and 4th floors, the 5th floor, looking forward to the operating theatres are going in. I'm very proud of the investment we're making in West Hants Hospital, Mr. Speaker, to open up that second OR. Very proud of the announcement that our government has made on the South Shore when it took investment to regional. Very proud of the work we're talking about at a healthcare clinic in New Waterford and in Pugwash, Mr. Speaker. Very proud of the fact that we made a commitment in the honourable member's riding of Shelburne, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, let me reassure the honourable member, it won't be like when he was in government when they actually went out and made announcements and no plans and no money to back it up, Mr. Speaker. We made a commitment to those communities. And Mr. Speaker, we've been able to do that, Mr. Speaker, because we struck a balance. Mr. Speaker. We paid what we believe is a fair wage increase to the entire public sector, at the same time creating job opportunities for other Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm certainly looking forward to the next 40 hours of deliberation on the health care budget. Mr. Speaker, the Liberal government has not opened a single CEC zero, Mr. Speaker. Meanwhile, ERs are closing and are at an all-time high, Mr. Speaker. Some hospital has been resorted to hallway medicine because of overcrowded ERs. Mr. Speaker, we have, I repeat, we have a crisis in health care system. This Liberal government does not seem to care as long as it can save some money along the way, Mr. Speaker. Will the Premier admit today that he has put his obsession with balancing the budget ahead of the health and safety of patients and health care workers in our hospitals?
The Honourable Premier.
And Mr. Speaker, again, thank the gentleman for the question. Mr. Speaker, I completely disagree with the preamble, Mr. Speaker. The question is insulting to all healthcare workers across this province who are working each and every day to ensure that when a Nova Scotian arrives at the healthcare communities in our province, they continue to provide them the top quality care.
Order, please. Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, they provide them with the top quality health care that these health care workers are known for, and we're going to continue to work with our partners across the province to continue to make sure that the infrastructure that was neglected by the NDP when they were in government, Mr. Speaker, gets improved, Mr. Speaker, in every community across this province. We're proud of the fact that we continue to work with our partners, and we're going to continue to do so, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, over the last 3 years, this Premier cut nursing home budgets to the point where our seniors were eating on less than $5 a day for 3 meals. Mr. Speaker, today the Premier is reinstating half of that cut, Mr. Speaker. That's not a plan to actually provide dignity to our seniors who live in nursing homes. That's damage control, Mr. Speaker. It's an admission of failure to look after our seniors in our nursing homes. I'd like to ask the Premier, will he now admit that his cuts to the nursing home budgets were cruel and, in fact, wrong?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Member for the question. We last year reduced by 1% the administration across health care budgets. We've seen, Mr. Speaker, that in some facilities they chose to do it another way. The Honourable Member reads that budget. He'll understand that the funding that is going into long-term care facilities are being targeted directly to the needs of seniors, Mr. Speaker, exactly where they told us they wanted them to go, towards ensuring that the food budgets are where they should be and an investment directly back into recreational facilities, opportunities in that community, Mr. Speaker. This is targeted funding, and it will make a difference in the lives of those people living in those facilities.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, every nursing home operator in this province will tell you that the Premier's cuts over the last 3 years got to the point where they were forced to cut the food budget. They didn't want to. Of course, people that look after our parents and grandparents didn't want to go there. They were forced to go there by this government to the point where 3 meals had to be provided on less than $5 a day. Today, the Premier is putting back half of that cut, Mr. Speaker. I thought that he might stand in his place today and say, you know what, we went too far, that was a mistake, and put that money back in, which would have been the right thing to do, Mr. Speaker, but he didn't do that. In light of all that, Mr. Speaker, knowing that that is the case, that seniors are being forced to eat on so little, if the Premier really cared, why didn't he reinstate the whole cut instead of just half?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the questions. I said in my first answer, Mr. Speaker, this funding is targeted funding, Mr. Speaker. It will be spent directly on the food budgets, special need diets of seniors in those facilities, Mr. Speaker, as well as the funding that will be directly targeted towards recreational opportunities in those facilities for those patients, the very things that we're told that were there, Mr. Speaker. We believed there was room of a 1% reduction in administration in long-term care facilities across the province. They chose to cut elsewhere, Mr. Speaker. This funding is targeted, and it will go directly towards seniors, Mr. Speaker. No options, no choice, directly towards seniors.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, $8 million over the last 2 years this government cut from long-term care facilities, Mr. Speaker. And at the time, the Premier said that these cuts had no impact on the quality of life of some of our most vulnerable seniors, Mr. Speaker. Now on the eve of an election, the government is telling us that they're giving half that money back to improve food budgets and recreational programs in long-term care. So let's give the opportunity to the Premier to apologize to Nova Scotians and admit that they went too far with cutting $8 million from nursing homes across this province.
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. As he would know, I've had the good fortune of traveling in this province, been in many nursing homes, seeing many residents, people that work in those facilities. I want to congratulate and thank all of those who are working there. I want to reassure the Honourable Member that those residents are getting top quality care, Mr. Speaker, that we've become known for in many of these facilities. I also want to reassure the Honourable Member that the investments that we're making in this budget are targeted directly towards the food budget and recreational programs, directly to programs and for seniors themselves. I want to reassure the Honourable Member that we made sure in this budget that would not go in administration.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, top quality care I can agree with. Top quality governing, I can't agree with, Mr. Speaker. They forced nursing homes all across this province to make difficult decisions, and now we see the government giving back half the money that they took from these long-term care facilities. Many of them, if not all of them, not-for-profit organizations, Mr. Speaker, running on a shoestring budget. They care about the patients and the residents that they provide care for, Mr. Speaker. Will the Premier refuse? Why does the Premier refuse to invest in long-term care, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that our seniors and those vulnerable Nova Scotians who live in long-term care facilities get the care they need and deserve, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to encourage the honourable member to read the budget. We've invested in long-term care, Mr. Speaker, facilities across the province with targeted funding. Again, this is the third or fourth budget that we've invested in home care, Mr. Speaker. We continue to make sure that seniors who require support and want to stay at home as long as possible are making those investments. The honourable member should also know this budget today, with one of the largest tax cuts in the history of our province, will impact those seniors in a positive way that is referring to, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue, Mr. Speaker, to work with seniors across the province to make the contribution that they've always made, Mr. Speaker, to continue to build this province, to continue to look forward. One of the things, Mr. Speaker, that's become very evident in this province, Mr. Speaker, that the negativity on that side of the House is not garnering support in the province of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia seniors remember full well when the Premier tried to jack up their pharmacare premiums, in many cases by 200%. Today, the Premier is telling them, and I quote from the budget, that he wants to spend $7.9 million to, quote, meet the needs of seniors enrolled in the pharmacare program. Well, Mr. Speaker, that is just more damage control, trying to fix up mistakes of the past, Mr. Speaker. That's not a plan to look after our seniors. So I'd like to ask the Premier, can he tell the House what extra benefits are seniors in pharmacare going to get from this $7.9 million?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member would know when we went through the pharmacare issue a year ago, Mr. Speaker, we were making sure that fewer Nova Scotians would be paying no premium. That was a positive thing. We also realized, Mr. Speaker, that we were solving one problem for one group of seniors, creating another. Mr. Speaker, I said at that time, it was an unintended consequences. We made that change. There had been no change for those seniors. What we're seeing now, there are many, many more Nova Scotians that will not be forced to pay a premium. The honourable member would also know that we're looking across the region of Atlantic Canada to build a potentially pharmacare system, with our hope that will be the impetus to build a national pharmacare program, continue to work with our partners and work with seniors across the province. I'm very proud of this investment. And honourable member, I would tell the honourable member and all members of the Association, I said to seniors, if we've made a mistake, we'll correct it, and that's exactly what we did when it came to the pharmacare program.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the question was, what new benefits are seniors getting from the $7.9 million? We got the answer, Mr. Speaker. There's none. The mistake the Premier made was misleading seniors in the first place about the pharmacare changes he was going to make 2 years ago. Now they're making the same mistake again. They're trying to tell seniors there's $7.9 million in enhancements to pharmacare. In fact, there are none, Mr. Speaker. That is just the normal increased usage from an aging population. There is no extra benefit today in this budget. The Premier is misleading our seniors again, Mr. Speaker. So why is the Premier telling seniors today they're getting something new when in fact nothing has changed?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the gentleman for the question again. I want to tell him, Mr. Speaker, there will be fewer Nova Scotians paying that premium. There will be more things added to the formulary. The honourable member should know that from his time in government. The challenge is, Mr. Speaker, he was presented with a real plan to move this province forward, and he's now looking desperately to find some way to fearmonger across the province and continue his journey of negativity from one end of this province to the other.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I do keep looking for a real plan. 4 years I've been waiting for a real plan from this Premier, and I'm still waiting today, Mr. Speaker. This, on the eve of an election, was their chance to show us a real plan, and you know what we got? We got damage control to try and cover up all the mistakes that they made in the last 4 years, Mr. Speaker. That is not a plan. And I'll give you an example, Mr. Speaker. Here we have a budget today where the amount set aside for the film industry is about $23 million. almost exactly the amount that they cut 2 years ago, Mr. Speaker. And we have a much smaller industry today, but we have a bigger fund, Mr. Speaker. How is that a plan where the government spends the same amount, but the industry's half of what it used to be, Mr. Speaker? So I'd like to ask the Premier, how can he justify having a smaller film industry and now spending just as much money as ever before?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, if he'd been paying attention at all, Mr. Speaker, he would have realized in the plan that was presented to him today, there are more seniors who will not pay a premium, Mr. Speaker. If he had known,
please. The Honourable Premier has the floor.
Speaker, if he paid attention to what the document today, he would realize that 4-year-olds in the province will have pre-primary from one end of the province to the other. He would recognize there's a breakfast program in this thing, Mr. Speaker. I'm looking forward to his support to move this document forward. Mr. Speaker, when he talks about the film industry, Mr. Speaker, they talked about the negativity. It was going to be the doom and gloom of the industry, Mr. Speaker. We've seen one of the largest films in the history of our province in this. Mr. Speaker, we've seen an industry come and work with government, unlike the opposition who continues to spread fear across the province. They've come. There are people working in the industry, Mr. Speaker. We're looking forward to that. And again, I want to also tell the honourable member that not only is that a labour subsidy for the industry, the subsidy is broad-based across a number of sectors, Mr. Speaker, and it's open and transparent today.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
No. Mr. Speaker, we see what happens when groups come to work with the government. The film industry came to work with the government, they slashed them. They're half the size they were today. Doctors came to work with the government, and they provide 1/5 of the doctors that our own Doctors Nova Scotia says are needed, Mr. Speaker. Teachers come to work with the government to get legislated back to work, Mr. Speaker. That's what happens when you work with this government. You get slammed down. That's not a plan. Now today they want to paper that all over, Mr. Speaker. My question was about the film industry. The Premier's answer had nothing to do with the film industry. No wonder. It's one of the biggest blunders that cost real jobs, and now they're spending just as much money anyway, Mr. Speaker. So I will ask the Premier if he will at least do this. With this budget, putting the fund back up to the expense from before, will he at least admit that that was a mistake that cost too many Nova Scotians their job, and this budget confirms it?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to remind the honourable member he should get outside of his office periodically and engage Nova Scotians about what's actually happening, Mr. Speaker. We're seeing one of the largest films in the history of this province come in under this program. We're seeing activity all across the province when it comes to this. We're seeing the public money that was invested in this industry being spread across a number of sectors. We're seeing economic growth, Mr. Speaker. We're seeing more young people attached to this economy. And we're continuing, Mr. Speaker, being very proud of the fact that the film sector, Screen Nova Scotia, came to work with us. We made adjustments to them. They're working with the program, creating good jobs, Mr. Speaker, across the province. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, we've been able to make investments through working hard with Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, to put us in a fiscal position where we can invest to create more jobs, to keep young people here, Mr. Speaker, where we can invest in classrooms across the province, Mr. Speaker, where we can ensure breakfast programs that are for young people, Mr. Speaker, when we can continue to grow the economy of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, one thing for certain, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians are more optimistic today about their future than they were 4 years ago.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier must know that Nova Scotia has the fastest rising tuition in the country. Post-secondary education is out of reach for many young people and getting further away every year. There is nothing in this budget to get those costs under control. Mr. Speaker, why is it not a priority of this government to address the rising cost of tuition?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to thank students, Nova Scotia students across the province who continue to come in and work with government, made positive suggestions about things that we could do to help them. Mr. Speaker, we accepted those. One of them is that we'll give tuition relief for anyone who finishes a degree in 5 years, Mr. Speaker. So that That means, Mr. Speaker, for those students who have a Nova Scotia student loan required to further their education, if they complete their degree in 5 years, they will not have to pay any Nova Scotia student loan.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia students have the highest average levels of debt upon graduation in Canada. And in this budget, the government wants to pat itself on the back for allowing students to take on more debt. Mr. Speaker, telling students who already owe tens of thousands of dollars they can borrow more is cold comfort. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier explain to students and their families who need tuition relief how taking on more debt is an improvement?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, students in Nova Scotia work very hard to come in and work with us. I do want to read to the honourable member part of a release they put out today. Today, students are happy to see the Nova Scotia government investing in students through the 2017-18 budget. The budget announces a $3.4 million for expansion of student assistance programs, the introduction of innovation to opportunity programs. Quote, Mr. Speaker, we are thrilled to see the budget release, said Colette Roberts, Chair of Student Nova Scotia. Although we recognize there's more work to do, we acknowledge that the provincial government is committed to investing in students, and we look forward to continuing to work with them. Mr. Speaker,
the honourable member for Dartmouth East. The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question's for the Minister of Health. Joe Grigg is a Canadian Navy veteran and 45-year resident of Dartmouth. His family doctor retired and the replacement left without anybody to pick up the patients. Mr. Grigg was told to register for a doctor by the health department, but was told the shortage in Dartmouth is particularly acute. He is on insulin and has had to rely on the pharmacist to temporarily extend his prescription, and that puts his life at risk. Mr. Speaker, why is it okay that Mr. Grigg and thousands of others in Dartmouth and across Nova Scotia are without family doctors, and how long should people like him be expected to wait?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to say that recent conversations with Dr. Lynn Harrigan in terms of how recruitment is going for this particular year, and yes, we've had many people who for years had relied on walk-in clinics, and now that many of them are needing or have reports coming back from specialists, it has put a surge in the Dartmouth area as one of our reasons to recruit for this year, and Dartmouth is one of the areas that will have doctors added, and nurse practitioners has been announced that will be added to existing clinics, not waiting for new collaborative care practices to develop.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The minister may have noticed that yesterday the Premier said, quote, I completely disagree with the fact the healthcare system is in crisis, and then he went on to say healthcare is not a crisis in this province. Now, we have tens of thousands of Nova Scotians without a family doctor. ERs are in crisis, with the Canadian Association of Emergency Physicians saying, quote, that there is a, quote, distinct level of human suffering associated with crowded emergency departments and crowded hospitals, unquote. Does the minister agree with the Premier that there is no crisis in the province's healthcare system?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We know that the member opposite is quoting from a national report. We know that in terms of even for family doctors, we're much better off than the Canadian average of 85%. We have 91% of Nova Scotians who have a family doctor, primary care provider, and we've already taken measures in our ERs, at the VG, the Halifax Infirmary, at Dartmouth General, to look after surge capacity.
The honourable member for Inverness.
If there is one thing that this government will be remembered for, it's for neglecting local rural roads. If you look at the budgets back in 2009 and 10, Mr. Speaker, this government has removed the equivalent of about $6 million adjusted for inflation each year from the rural road maintenance budget. Now, on the eve of an election, they're trying to pretend to Nova Scotians that they're doing them a favour by giving them half of that back here in the budget today. So, Mr. Speaker, we're catching this, and we're telling Nova Scotians this. Will the Premier admit that the decision for this new gravel road and to issue it as part of this budget is admitting that neglecting rural roads over the term of this government was a mistake.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we continue to invest in rural roads all across the province. Mr. Speaker, for the last 4 years, we continue to make investments from one end of this province to the other. We were fortunate to be able to come in to get rid of the full plan that the former NDP government had when they bought a paving plant to compete against the private sector. We've seen now very positive signs, very competitive rates. We're seeing lots of activity, and very proud of the fact the minister brought forward a $10 million plan around gravel roads. Mr. Speaker, written the capital plan. It's the first time, Mr. Speaker, in the history of our province that has taken place. It's shown great leadership in his part. In fact, he's gone around and listened to communities. And we're going to continue, Mr. Speaker, to work with those hard-working Nova Scotians to continue to improve the infrastructure in their communities.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
You know, Mr. Speaker, I think about the hard-working Nova Scotians that work in the Department of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal. Those are the people that are living with the stress, hearing the complaints day in and day out about the state of the roads. They're the ones who have had to deal with this budget cut over the last number of years, and now the government's trying to tell people that they've got it all fixed and hand half the money back. Well, Mr. Speaker, we see through it. In 2014, I introduced a resolution. The government members here voted against it. They voted it down. That resolution called for the restoration of that RIM budget. So, Mr. Speaker, this is putting stress on the people. I had somebody tell me the other day the roads are so bad, why not take the trails? So, Mr. Speaker, why is the government treating roads and the people who live on them this way, pretending they're doing them a favour before an election, when really we know the past number of years people have been let down by this government?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to reassure him when I travel across this province, Nova Scotians do not feel let down by this government, Mr. Speaker. They feel fully supported, Mr. Speaker. They think finally, Mr. Speaker, a government that has continued to make investments in communities across this province. We're looking forward to continuing to make those investments. This, Mr. Speaker, this budget is a reflection of the hard work that Nova Scotians have been able to do over the last number of years. Mr. Speaker, this budget is a document that's optimistic about the future of our province, and as long as they continue to be negative about the future of this province, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians will continue to respond to them the way they're responding to them now.
The honourable member for Sydney River, Myra, Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, my question through you is for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, the month of April is Amputee Month, and it is not unusual for an above-the-knee amputee, AK as they call it, to make 15 to 25 trips to Halifax a year and stay for 4 days or more in a hotel in order to tweak the knee each trip. And Mr. Speaker, the higher the amputation, the more complications and tweaking are involved. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Minister is quite simple. Would the Minister please reinstate and reopen the satellite amputee clinic, which was located in the Northside Hospital, so that Cape Bretoners and others do not have to travel so far to get their service?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member opposite for a very, very important question he's brought here to the House today. I know one of the things that I certainly am very proud as a member of this government to have raised the BTO, first of all, the Board Transportation and Ostomy Program, which hadn't been improved upon in about a 20-year period, and we've just about doubled the amount given out, but also the threshold is so dramatically improved. This is an important service to Nova Scotians, and I will take that certainly under consideration. I met with Bob Locke recently, who does a phenomenal job in the QE2 rehab, and people like that, I think, can give us great insight on what we should be doing in other parts of the province.
The honourable member for Sydney River, Myra, Lewisburg.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I agree with the Minister. There is no question that this is a very important issue. As a matter of fact, I've had conversations and had the opportunity to use the facilities that are available to us here in Halifax. But the issue for a lot of people is not coming here for rehab, not having your leg built, but it's actually about the tweaking that has to go into it. And sometimes you have a 4-hour drive for a 10-minute appointment to get something tweaked, and then you have to go back, and it takes time. 60% of the people that travel to this clinic are from Cape Breton Island. And they need the service. We have the facility in place. Mr. Speaker, this is a very important question, that we have the facility in place. It was there before in Cape Breton. I've talked to the director, I've talked to the minister and some of his staff members about this before. There is a need. There's a financial burden on people if we don't open that clinic, so I am going to implore upon him, his Premier and his Cabinet to please open that clinic for the people of Cape Breton Island that need to get their prosthetics tweaked.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite, who I know many occasions bring very important and sensitive topics to the floor. And what I will tell the member opposite today is that I will assign this to my Deputy Minister to do an immediate look and review of that particular program, and I can see and have a great deal of hope that something can be accomplished.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier wants Nova Scotians to believe this is a good news budget. Well, I'm sorry to burst his bubble, but I'd have to say a huge number of citizens are not exactly jumping for joy right now. As NDP critic of both education and film and television, I'd be remiss if I did not use this opportunity to ask the Premier if, when he goes to the doors, to knock on doors this next election cycle, can he honestly look into the faces of Nova Scotian filmmakers and tell them how much he has improved the creative economy and specifically the film industry? And can he actually tell teachers he's proud to have balanced this budget on their backs through a legislated contract?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. Governing is about making choices, Mr. Speaker. We came into government following an NDP government that destroyed the finances of this province. We had to make some difficult choices. They made a choice when they were in power to provide a 7.5% pay raise across the entire public sector and cut $65 million out of classrooms, Mr. Speaker. We took a different approach. We took a different approach, Mr. Speaker. We took a different approach, Mr. Speaker. We took a balanced approach. We went in and we provided what is a reasonable increase of salary across the entire public sector, at the same time making investments in classrooms, investing in home care, Mr. Speaker, making sure we're going to invest in a breakfast program, investing, Mr. Speaker, to continue to make sure that the important services Nova Scotians want are there, at the same time making investments in innovation and creativity to provide economic opportunity and job opportunities in this province.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I love to hear how the Premier changes the course of history afterwards, because we actually got a AAA credit score for the first time in the history of this province. That was an NDP government that did that, and we balanced the budget. So, Mr. Speaker, budgets are not budgets, Mr. Speaker, budgets are about choices. Budgets are about priorities. If this government really wanted to improve classroom conditions, we would have seen it in this budget. So, Mr. Speaker, my question is, for the Premier, why did he choose not to invest in classrooms by capping class sizes, as teachers have been asking?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, while the NDP has been huddled up with the Nova Scotia Teachers Union, Mr. Speaker, we've actually been talking to classroom teachers, Mr. Speaker. We provided them with funding, Mr. Speaker, to make changes in classrooms. We are looking for a report that will come out tomorrow with the recommendations that will come forward. We made it very clear. We'll accept those recommendations. We're very encouraged by the fact that those teachers are so positive and optimistic about the future of this province because they see an investment in classrooms. They also see, Mr. Speaker, that their students have a future in this province. They see job opportunities being created. They see economic opportunities being created. They're very lucky, and I'm sure they're going to welcome the breakfast program, Mr. Speaker, when it comes in. And I'm looking forward to continuing to work, Mr. Speaker, with with Nova Scotia to go forward. And she is absolutely right, Mr. Speaker. Governing is about choices, Mr. Speaker, and so are elections. And Nova Scotians are going to get a chance to make a choice.
The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Health. Over the last number of months, there have been a number of announcements that have happened, especially when it rolls around to the Kentville dialysis unit, the new dialysis unit for Digby, renovated dialysis unit, an expansionist dialysis unit for Bridgewater. So there's been a change in the way government is treating the Nova Scotia dialysis program and moving some of those services around. So he knows that over the last number of years I've been asking for the community of Barrington Passage. Barrington have been looking for the possible of a satellite dialysis unit, and I was wondering if that might be in the plans somewhere hidden in this budget document.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What I can tell the member opposite is that, yes, we've made a considerable... we made a considerable... My friend who occupied this role jumps on every word, you know. But in fact, we looked very seriously at some of the deficits that we have in the provincial program. The goal is to have somebody who has that burden of 3 times a week to at least be within travel distance of about an hour. And as a result of our investments, the Halifax Infirmary, Dartmouth, Kentville, Digby, another satellite site is now four centres closer to that goal.
The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. So I think what the Minister is telling me is that I need to find a way to move Yarmouth closer to one of those centres. I don't think I can do that. So what I'm asking the Minister again is that within his deliberations within his department, because it fits under that 1 hour of travel, on good days, if you're living on the Hawk, you're living in Clark's Harbour, you're over an hour to get to Yarmouth. And those are on good days. When it's bad days, it makes it worse. And you can only imagine the human toll that is that happens when these individuals have to travel for extra amounts of time. So, Mr. Speaker, once again, I will ask the Minister. He had the right answer there, but he did fluff it a bit. But could we make sure that the consideration for a dialysis unit at a 1 hour point in the Barrington area would be considered in the future?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the member opposite for the question. And I've been in Barrington and in those communities that he's referencing here, and met with some of the passionate residents who want to see an improvement in dialysis. And I know, first of all, we had to look at places like Long Island, Briar Island, and realize that they had perhaps, without question, the longest travel of anywhere in the province. And in this fall, that project will be underway. And also, the member opposite is making a great point. It's another one of those geographies that poses a challenge, and we'll certainly be having the department to continue to work on resolving that issue.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Community Services. I have a question about the plans for the Riverview home. We have a number of people that make their home there, and for many of them, the staff there is a family for them, and the staff are pretty concerned about what the future is for the Riverview home. They read the headlines about the move to smaller community homes, and I wonder if the Minister can just update the House on what are the plans specifically for Riverview home, and will there be smaller option homes built on that property, or maybe the Minister can just enlighten us a bit. Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, and I thank the member opposite for the question. As he knows, when we came into government, we committed to the roadmap, the transformation for persons with disabilities, of moving out of larger residential facilities and having folks move into the communities of their choice. It was all about choice. It was all about better outcomes. We've worked very hard, the department staff and folks from Riverview and Sunset and King's Rehabilitation, to work out a plan of how that decade-long change is going to look. So they are coming with us in every step of the way. There will be capacity that will be built. I'm so pleased to announce that there will be at least 4 new small options built from this budget in communities all around Nova Scotia, and it really is a process that will bring choice to persons who are in those larger institutions.
The honourable member for Pickering East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the minister. It sounds like it's a decade-long process. We're somewhere in that stage for Riverview, but Riverview is about 90-bed facility, 90-room facility. They make their money when people are in those beds. That's how they get paid, and their budgets are always tight. But people are concerned that they're seeing it's taking a little longer to fill the beds when they become vacant. There's been some policy changes around when somebody moves in. They have to have a plan within 6 months, I think, to move them out within 3 years. The long and short of it, there's lots of policy things that are happening. At the moment, I think there's 3 or 4 beds vacant at that home. That's 3 or 4% of their budget that they're not getting. So it's tight time for the budgets, and the staff are concerned. And maybe the minister can just comment to bring some concern, bring some relief in the ease of distress to the people that are working there as to what the plan is. Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, and the member is quite correct. There has been policy changes. We committed last June that there would be no more long-term placements in larger residential facilities, in keeping with the spirit of the roadmap, because we are moving into community-based options for living. We are also working very closely with the Department of Health, because at the end of the day, we have a lot of infrastructure that will be left in these communities that could perhaps be repurposed into other areas, perhaps into longer-term care for communities. So there's all kinds of options that are open. But please rest assured that we are working with people who are living and working in these long-term facilities, because we're all moving along with this together.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, this Liberal government was elected on a promise of a doctor for every Nova Scotian. They had 3.5 years to do this work, Mr. Speaker, and what do we have to show for it? Approximately 100,000 Nova Scotians without a family doctor, and a medical student tuition relief program for 25 students that has never been fully utilized, Mr. Speaker. So I'll give another chance for the Premier to stand up and admit that he had failed to deliver on his election promise in 2013.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member for the question. He knows there have been a number of programs that are available to recruit physicians across the province. As you would know also, when he was Minister of Health prior to the last election, that there was no human resource plan around physician recruitment or the physicians that we currently had in terms of retaining. When we tore down the walls in the healthcare system, we began to realize that there were 9 different programs out there, how they were happening. We came, Mr. Speaker, now have a one plan for the entire province. The budget today was announcing that we'd be additional 20 residency seats on top of the residencies that we currently have, which will add 50 physicians that will be made available. It will also build on top of the other recruitment activity that has taken place across the province. He also knows, I know he's a big proponent of this, that we provide other health care providers access to primary health care, so that we provide a team around nurse practitioners, family practice nurse, paramedics, who the honourable member was a member of that profession, and they were doing work now. They do some work actually in the emergency in the community health centre that I live near. So continuing to make sure that we deal with the solutions that are creative and unique to each individual community, so that all healthcare providers have access to providing us primary care.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
I'm well aware of the rural residency program, Mr. Speaker, because it was our government that brought it in, and it's been fully utilized since it started. Unlike the government's program of 25 medical student tuition program that has not materialized, Mr. Speaker. We know that the Premier is going to expect Nova Scotians to believe him with his promises this time around. In the public accounts, we heard from Doctors Nova Scotia that Nova Scotia needs 100 doctors a year for the next 10 years. This budget provided for 20 family doctors. 3 years late, Mr. Speaker, and a few hundred short. So I'd like to ask the Premier, when will he commit to ensuring that Nova Scotians in this province has access to care, and really make sure he follow through on it, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Premier.
You had 30 seconds. Mr. Speaker, it's not uncommon for the Leader of the Conservative Party to, Mr. Speaker, use numbers inappropriately, but I'm surprised that the Honourable Member, who was the former Minister of Health, would do by quoting Doctors Nova Scotia inappropriately. What they have said, Mr. Speaker, we require 50 family practice physicians as well as about 50 specialists in the province. If he goes back and looks at the number of resident seats we have now, this is building on another 20 to give us over and above the 50 the number. Mr. Speaker, it's okay. Mr. Speaker, I'll be back tomorrow and we can finish this question.
Thank you very much. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move on to government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, do you please call public bills and orders for third reading?
We'll now call public bills.
Diana, you ready?
For third reading. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Speaker, would you please call Bill number 59, the Accessibility Act?
We'll now call Bill number 59, the Accessibility Act. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And it seems like a sudden changing of gears, doesn't it? So we're here today. Let me just begin with the proper sentence. It's, Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 59, an act respecting accessibility in Nova Scotia, be now read a third time and do pass. So well done? Good. Thank you. So with that, Mr. Speaker, that really sets out our goal today. We had the Committee of the Whole on Tuesday, an opportunity for us to review the many amendments that had come through from the consultation with community advocates, with the disabled